At Verizon, we keep companies ready for what's next. When it comes to digital transformation, we're here and we're ready. The Alliance is brought to you by Verizon.
For more than 100 years, Australia and the United States have fought alongside one another. Brothers in arms since World War I, our nations share a great deal more than the white stars proudly stitched on our national flags. We might be separated by the world's largest ocean, but there's so much that brings us together. In Part 5, we look at the business and finance powering our two nations through recovery, at a time when China poses a clear and present threat. Bringing peace, security and growth to the region is the critical mission for the Alliance.
I have no problem with the masks. We will achieve a victory over the virus by unleashing America's scientific genius, which is what it is.
The United States, it's our most important alliance. We both want to see our economies go forward. We want to see people back in jobs.
It is still far too early to assess the damage from COVID-19. Over 150,000 American lives have been lost to the virus. In Australia, Victoria battles a second wave. Masks outside are mandatory. With lives and livelihoods under constant threat, our leaders must chart the best course for a recovery, somehow balancing our own health and the health of our two economies. The task is big. Borders are shut, business shuttered. In the US, we are 3 months out from the election.
Do your job, Mr. President, because if we can't deal with the public health crisis, we can't deal with the economic crisis.
Few understand the crisis better than James Gorman. One of 10 children, Gorman grew up in Melbourne, rising to become Wall Street's most admired banker, and this year awarded the Order of Australia for his work. In March, the chairman and CEO of Morgan Stanley was struck by the coronavirus.
I don't want to overstate it. I was described it to the board as I'm sick, but I'm not ill. I was not hospitalized. There's a big difference. And fortunately, I've remained pretty fit for the last decade. So I do a lot of rowing on a machine, and maybe that helped my lungs. A lot of others have not been fortunate. It's been tragic. I've sort of watched what Australia's going through with COVID, and I have a little bit of envy. I know it's been tough down there, but we were having 700 people dying a day in New York for weeks on end. So it was pretty extraordinary.
I speak to James Gorman on Morgan Stanley's results day. Remarkably, the best results in 85 years.
Well, it's been really a 10-year journey. We came out of the last financial crisis very damaged, and we took a lot of illiquid risk positions, which hurt our company, and we vowed never to be in that position again.
Gorman shifted the business into wealth management, where the bank now ranks number 3 in the world. What is more, not one job has been lost in the COVID crisis.
We made a conscious decision in, I think, February this year, and in fact I asked the operating committee to vote on it, it was unanimous, that we would not lay off anybody in this company this year, whatever happened with the crisis. They had enough to worry about with the health crisis and what was going on with their families, and they didn't need to worry about their job at Morgan Stanley.
Governments and central banks of both alliance partners are pumping in stimulus to avoid scarring the economy. Long-term unemployed, young without futures. But much of what needs doing is practical.
Firstly, we've got to nip this second wave in the bud. In Texas and California and Florida are each exhibiting 10,000 cases a day. This is insane. People need to get with the program. It's pretty straightforward. Social distance, wear a mask, respect the health of others. But the other balance is we've seen enormous damage from completely shutting businesses. And I do think we could have kept businesses open with appropriate social distancing and protocols about cleanliness and mask wearing and so on without completely destroying businesses. So we've made the recovery much deeper here, the problem much deeper. And if I were in Australia, I would be careful not to overreact. I mean, the long-term social, mental health costs of putting so many people out of work, to protect perfection is a trade-off I'd be very careful about making.
Here in Australia, the government is looking to another business leader for advice, Andrew Liveris. Like Gorman, Liveris is an alliance story. A boy from Darwin, he went on to run American multinational Dow Chemical. And he's done recoveries before. Andrew Liveris advised Presidents Obama and Trump on making America great again. His solution? Bringing manufacturing and jobs back to the US. Manufacturing that had been hollowed out in the 90s by globalization.
It sort of missed everyone. Everyone missed it. So in the US, the economy went down to about 11% of being manufacturing. During the time I became CEO, it was down at 11. When I joined Dow, it was at 35%. So the manufacturing economy that was the producer of jobs, the producer of new things, if you don't have manufacturing, you can't have invention. Invention occurs from the shop floor. We drank the Kool-Aid from management consultants. We started learning about productivity. And productivity is the enemy of invention. Productivity, if you try and say to scientists and technologists, be productive. If you said to Jeff Bezos, be productive, okay, he would never have created the business model. So this great inventive economy called the United States of America was not inventing. It missed batteries. It missed all the solar stuff, all the new energy technologies, renewables. So I wrote a book that laid all this out.
Make It in America came out in 2011.
President Obama picked up on the medium to long-term things to do, which was to, in essence, create 11 manufacturing institute hubs in the country. We put them in the parts of the country that needed the jobs the most. Those institutes are alive and well and thriving today. 11 new Silicon Valleys were created in the United States, which amplified and created 1.5 million new jobs.
In 2016, 2 days after Donald Trump was elected president, Liveris got a call.
So we had this meeting with his key lieutenants there, including all electees, right, all about to be Vice President Pence electee. I mean, Jared Kushner was there, Ivanka was there, they were all there. And President Trump there was my book in front of him. And he said, okay, I want these things done, and I want you to do them. I said, yes, Mr. President-elect.
You're paving the way with your administration, with your policies, to make it easier to do business in this country. Not a red tape country, but a red carpet country for American businesses.
In December 2017, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act slashed red tape and company tax and delivered a huge tax incentive for business investment.
The thing that we've benefited from in America is accelerated depreciation for investment. I think something like 90% of all money that comes out of companies all around the world either goes to dividends or share buybacks, whereas giving people accelerated depreciation for manufacturing investment is a good way to channel it into jobs.
Yep, so that tax reform, which included lowering company tax cuts, but also the accelerated depreciation, that was quite significant.
Yeah, it was. And, you know, there was a big surge in investment in the economy as a result of that.
Like Anthony Pratt, mining magnate Gina Rinehart is also a big fan of President Trump's reforms. Mrs. Rinehart pays more company tax than any other private business in Australia from her huge operations like the Roy Hill mine.
I think businesses need to speak up and be much more proactive towards explaining and driving the economic changes that should be made to welcome investment and create jobs in Australia. We should also encourage our politicians who recently made positive statements towards cutting tape and taxes, like President Reagan and Prime Minister Thatcher did to kickstart their economies. Frankly, it should be obvious the USA's present government has shown the way. Do two simple things: significantly cut government tape and cut taxes. With the expense of COVID and more billions being spent and added to our national debt, our Australian economy, other than part of the mining industry, is in despair. Over 1 million Australians are out of jobs and on welfare. And this will get worse if tape and tax aren't significantly cut.
With the new National Cabinet in Australia giving state leaders more responsibility, Mrs. Rinehart is calling for the size and cost of government to be cut and for root and branch reform to create jobs.
Now is the time to abolish payroll tax, a tax against employment, a tax that was supposed to be abolished when GST came in years ago. Now is the time to abolish penalties for the late payment of taxes, when most businesses are already suffering from COVID, or at least incurring higher costs given COVID. This is an opportunity to provide an exciting future for our country. But it won't happen with just more talk of tax or tape cutting. Significant cuts need to happen.
American investment is there to see at Roy Hill, where Mrs. Reinhardt's pink trains raising breast cancer awareness lace the landscape, hauling iron ore for export. But she says much more could be done to attract further investment in both mining and agriculture.
Mining is subject to excessive government tape and compliance burdens in Australia, which don't encourage investment or help to create jobs or revenue. Governments too often cave into the noisy anti-mining minority groups who don't care for those in the mining and related industries, who depend on mining for their own and their families' living, or the next generation needing jobs. I hate to think how low our living standards in Australia would be without this essential mining industry. In the US, we have seen President Trump truly act to improve the regulatory environment for business, including mining.
So, before the pandemic hit, how successful would you rate the Trump policies?
Yeah, I'd give him an A+, and I'm on record for saying that. I mean, so, you know, what's really difficult about that is you've got to divorce yourself from the character and the person and look at the policies. And on a business basis, they're the best policies for business in the world.
And job numbers before COVID hit?
Through the roof, unemployment down to 3. The magic threes, right? 3% unemployment, 3% wage growth, and 3% GDP growth he attained. That hadn't been done since World War II.
Before the COVID pandemic, the US had the best economy, I think, in its history. Record levels of investment, record highs for the share market, the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years, record numbers of people off welfare and food stamps, and very high business and consumer confidence. These are massive achievements. Unfortunately, the COVID pandemic, which originated elsewhere, was beyond President Trump's control and has affected the US and world economic landscape.
Yet the challenges posed by COVID could drive reform faster. In Australia, Andrew Liveris wants to use this crisis as a burning platform to jump off into reform.
How to create a viable long-term manufacturing sector that suits the country's competitive advantages. How to do it with a 21st century toolbox, not a 20th century toolbox. So not tariffs, not subsidies, not protectionism. We are a high-quality nation. You know, our labour is expensive and should be. You know, we want a high quality of life for everybody. So what's the contextual answer to that in terms of what type of jobs we can create in the country? And what's our competitive advantage? That was the questions that I was asked to help answer, and certainly I'm willing volunteer, but I felt great, finally a chance to serve my country.
Throughout this crisis, it is our alliance ties that underpin recovery. Our big banks, the 4 pillars propping up Australia, are funded by Wall Street to the tune of billions. Matt Comyn runs Australia's biggest bank.
Well, the US is the most significant international market by far. The BlackRock, State Street, Fidelities, they're both equity and debt investors. We've got a number of also of the pension funds supportive that we meet with regularly. In the old days when we'd be going through the investor roadshows, go and meet them in person, but at the moment it's much more from a remote basis. Clearly we keep in touch on the banking side with a number of the financial institutions, the Wall Street banks.
And so having an Aussie like James Gorman running one of the big Wall Street banks, is that important to the alliance, do you think?
Well, I think it is, and it's very helpful. James typically comes through Australia once a year. He's also very accessible. I've met with him both in Sydney as well as in New York. And they're such a significant financial institution, but I find the US financial institutions very accessible, and so we tend to be able to go and meet with them when we're there, and they probably come here much less frequently. James would be the exception to that. So I think it definitely helps to have someone as part of the alliance with such strong roots to Australia.
Australia's mining boom saved us through the GFC, and we kept our AAA credit rating. But with a $184 billion deficit forecast for next year,
New growth is needed to pay down sovereign debt and keep the AAA status.
The AAA rating is not something to be messed around with. That's a massive sovereign risk advantage for Australia, and I would not give that up. But listen, at the end of the day, Australia is a very prosperous country, but it's a relatively small country with a small population. It is dependent upon foreign institutions and foreigners buying a lot of what Australia produces, grows, etc. So I think having a very stable sovereign risk and stable banking system is essential to the economic balance in the country.
But how can we fund the recovery for the long term? Anthony Pratt believes the solution is super, and America is leading the way with super fund lending.
So, for example, we borrow 30-year debt in America at like 4%, locked in, fixed, mortgage-style amortisation, and that's the pension funds that lend, not the banks. Whereas in Australia, so in America, 40% of all pension fund investment is lending to companies like us. In Australia, only 1% of superannuation funds are lent. The rest of it is equity invested.
But we've got so much super here.
Yeah, exactly. So it's going to be $7 trillion by 2030 in super funds, which is 3 times the size of the Australian economy. So I think it's a great opportunity.
From Wall Street, James Gorman agrees.
I would use the asset pile that Australia has developed over 30 or 40 years. You know, as a stroke of genius, the super funds, it's set the country up with a level of stability that is the envy of most of the world. These are the times when you take advantage of that. I would encourage the super funds to diversify and invest directly in the country, in some of the infrastructure of the country, the business of the country that needs support coming out of this crisis.
Coming up, we look at the businesses that have already made their mark stateside and find out what lessons we can learn for here.
The Alliance is brought to you by Hancock Prospecting, mates, business partners and allies.
The Alliance, proudly brought to you by Visy, packaging for the food and beverage industries to keep our supermarkets open.
Open for business.
From the get-go, Donald Trump understood that well-paid jobs were key to the fortunes of both nations. Now they are more important than ever. Australian businessman Anthony Pratt shares the Trump philosophy, and in 2016 he pledged billions of dollars of investment in American manufacturing if Trump won the presidency. And he delivered with a new paper mill and jobs in Wapakoneta, Ohio.
And it's projects like this that we hope have helped you, Mr. President, to create 6 million jobs and be the most job-creating president.
Pratt has a track record for manufacturing jobs stateside, even in the Big Apple. It was the entrepreneur in Anthony Pratt that recognised he could harvest waste here in New York and recycle it on an industrial scale.
It was a revolutionary idea. Pratt Industries decided to build a paper mill right here on Staten Island, miles away from any forests. The input wasn't timber, it was rubbish from New York City, piling up daily behind me.
The paper mill in New York was the only paper mill ever built in New York City, and it's also the largest manufacturing investment of any kind in New York City since World War II.
Normally you'd think about a paper mill being fed by pulp.
Exactly. Our paper mill concept that we exported from Australia was very much about collecting waste from the streets of New York and other cities around the world, putting it through our paper mill to make big rolls of paper, and then turning it into cardboard boxes like the ones Amazon uses. So that, in a sense, is our supply chain.
Munir Ahmed is the general manager for Pratt Paper in New York. He joined the business straight out of college back in 1996.
Pratt's been unique for a very long time. The concept of producing cardboard paper consuming 100% mixed waste was unheard of, and it's still really not practical for a lot of big companies, a lot of other competitors. So we are currently consuming a lot of municipal waste, curbside pickup, post-consumer waste paper as a raw material. And we're the only company all around North America who can actually do it.
On its final trip, Rubbish takes in some of the best views of New York, barged up the Hudson River. These days, Pratt recycles around 250,000 tonnes of New York's waste paper each year. That's 3/4 of the city's collectible waste. Once it arrives at Staten Island, the rubbish is unloaded, sorted, pulped and cleaned before being converted into paper and corrugated into pizza boxes.
This is one of the greatest sustainable, environmentally friendly job market that you want to be working in.
Pratt employs more than 9,000 highly skilled workers across 25 states, and the company is growing. In the last decade, it has constructed 3 new major capacity mills in North America, building them from the ground up.
These are green-collar jobs everywhere we're going. Wapakoneta, a small town, creating jobs. And these are high-paid jobs and very good, lucrative benefits along with it.
In many ways, New York City presents the same challenges to manufacturers as the Australian market: high labour and high energy costs.
It took us a long time to settle that mill down, and so New York is, if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere because it is so tough.
Outside the city that never sleeps, something happened that was a game changer for business. Sitting underneath America, in the shale rock, were vast supplies of energy, oil and gas. Known about since the 1820s, in 2000, the technology arrived to produce it.
It was like a gift from heaven. I mean, the George Mitchell, who took horizontal drilling down to the depths of where shale rock is, changed the view towards affordable energy in the United States. It not only created the gas revolution that you mentioned, shale gale, but also brought oil with it, which gave US energy independence.
Exactly, it went from an importer to an exporter.
Yeah, and as a result of that, you can change your geopolitics.
Cheap gas put a rocket under American manufacturing. But in a global world, our manufacturers were now struggling to compete. In April 2005, Aussie fertiliser business Incitec Pivot made the shock announcement that it would be spending $1 billion on a new plant in Louisiana, not Australia.
Australia's tough, very, very tough. I mean, you've got to be, the winner of the gold medal at the Olympics just to survive in business in Australia, and particularly in manufacturing. If you want an example of that, look no further than energy. Electricity is unreliable in some states, and in other states, gas is very, very important to us, and we've got state governments that won't even let it be explored or developed. Now, there can be no greater messages that we don't want your manufacturing here than that.
Lindsay Partridge has been at Aussie manufacturer Brickworks for 35 years.
In 1999, I became CEO, and in the year 2000, I became managing director. At that time, we had 5 factories in 2 states, New South Wales and Queensland. And I guess you say the last 20 years I've spent building the company to what it is today.
So bricks, I mean, this is salt of the earth manufacturing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm a ceramic engineer, and this is what I do, make bricks.
2 years ago, attracted by cheap energy, Partridge bought up the 4th largest brick manufacturer in the US, Glengarry.
We have a lot of things in common with Americans, an enormous number of things in common with them, besides the obvious, the language and the laws and the similar English heritage. We're both one of maybe half a dozen countries in the world that use face bricks. They're not common everywhere, and of course North America is most probably the biggest market. It's 5 times the size of Australia. Texas alone uses more bricks than Australia. We'd be doing 10 high schools at the moment. Well, a high school in the US is 1 million bricks. You can imagine how many bricks goes into a football stadium or a baseball stadium. They're just massive projects.
Now brickmaking in Australia and the United States, Brickworks has lessons for the Alliance in both energy and efficiency.
What is the difference between the US and here?
Bottom line is we're paying $2 a gigajoule for gas in Pennsylvania. There's a lot of coal seam gas there. The whole state's been drilled. And we pay $9 to $10 a gigajoule for gas around Australia. So let's say basically 5 times that amount.
Gas prices favoured America, but other factors favoured Australia. The global financial crisis hit the US much harder than Australia, where Brickworks upgraded its kilns and became 20% more efficient.
If you look at the machinery, you know, we went from our third to fourth generation of machineries. We're about to deploy our fifth generation of machines in Australia. Whereas America got frozen in time at the GFC. There was no investment. So the equipment in the factories got left behind. So this incredible gap opened up where our productivity runs 3 to 5 times better than it does in the US, and yet our cheapest manufacturing for bricks anywhere in the world is in the United States. That just shows you how low the cost base is in the US compared to Australia. So even when you're that good, it's still cheaper to manufacture in the US.
Trump reforms and cheap gas made America open for business and has put pressure on Australia to do the same.
You put on 25 people and you get a letter from the governor thanking you. I mean, things like this we almost fall over in Australia. I mean, whether or not things are going to change because of the COVID virus, but pre-COVID, I mean, the politicians in Australia were unavailable, unresponsive, and you could raise serious issues with them for, like the gas, for 10 years, and there's no response. There's been no action, no steps taken in a decade to overcome a major problem for manufacturing in Australia.
While America was riding the shale gale for its domestic manufacturing, Australia looked to the export market for its huge oil and gas reserves. Investment and export earnings poured in, but manufacturers cried foul.
Our policy on fossil fuels is approached the absurd. Okay? I mean, we have literally charging ourselves more for power in this country than Japan, where we sell the gas to.
This is an example of your globalisation push being taken to the extreme.
Well, mostly because we don't sit here with a national energy policy and a national policy as it relates to the transition. We need one. We need one badly, and we need one that actually manages the transition. This burning platform's given us the chance to do it.
For years from New York, Liveris had been lobbying for cheap Australian gas. Right at the peak of our COVID crisis, the government brought him on board to advise on a manufacturing recovery. Liveris believes, done right, reform could deliver a gas price as low as $4 a gigajoule.
Look, my experience has shown me the pathways to get to as low as $4 a gigajoule are here. They're here.
So for the gas sector's point of view, they'd come back and say, well, Andrew Liveris says he doesn't like subsidies. This sounds like an awfully big subsidy for industry to us at our expense.
Please go study the US, the UK, Argentina, Germany. No subsidies. This is without subsidy. This is actually doing the most simple business course, market economics course you could do. It's actually bolting up demand with supply. Stop this thing in the middle called stopping supply, get to demand. In fact, supply goes offshore because it can't get to local demand. So the Incitec pivots, look at that and say, I can't get supply. I've got to go build in X, Louisiana in their case. And that's what business does. It looks at saying, I can't get supply to my demand. I've got to shut down my demand. So market economic 101, let's bolt up supply and demand. Okay, and let's make it possible for the producers to make a return. I mean, I'm a businessman. I'm not going to put people into production at losing economics. Why would you do that? It has to make economic sense. This is a pathway to make economic sense at $6 and $4.
Coming up, resilience in the recovery. How defence spending will strengthen our economy and the alliance.
This program is proudly brought to you by Brickworks Building Products, inspiring the built environment with sustainable, beautiful products that last forever.
This program is brought to you by Lockheed Martin Australia. Your mission is ours.
Even before the global pandemic, relations between the superpowers were fractious.
We have not seen the conflation of global economic and strategic uncertainty now being experienced here in Australia, in our region, since the existential threat we faced when the global and regional order collapsed in the 1930s and 1940s.
This week, and despite COVID,
Australia's Foreign Minister and Defence Minister were in Washington for face-to-face alliance AUSMIN talks. Australia has now backed the US in formally rejecting China's claims in the South China Sea. Assistant Secretary of State David Stilwell has spent many years in the region and is fluent in Chinese. The AUSMIN talks come at a critical time.
You saw the statement, and I think what you saw is a very clear statement of concern for the trends in the region, but also a positive assessment of the improvements in our relationship as we deal with corona, increasing threats from afar, and the economic issues that are going to result from the pandemic. And so the ability to sit down together, break bread over dinner, enjoy some informal time, and then on breaks between sessions, be able to work through some of the maybe trickier aspects of the relationship, that's irreplaceable.
For the government, a more dangerous and disorderly Indo-Pacific region requires a response. It has committed a massive $270 billion to boost our capabilities over the next decade. And with COVID heightening the risk to security of our supply chains, the new defence spending will also strengthen our sovereign industrial capability and deliver jobs.
This program is delivering thousands of jobs. Even more important as we come out of the COVID-19 recession, and this will grow over the coming years.
Already underway, the programme aims to bring Australia's land and sea capabilities up to speed with our Air Force. And on defence, Australia turns first to America.
If you talk to the major U.S. defence contractors, Australia is either their first or second most important market outside the United States. They're all here in force, and they should be. There's a lot of strength here, a lot of expertise here.
Importantly, it is the trust built over decades between Australia and the US that allows us to take an even bigger role in delivering our upgrades.
Recently, Lockheed Martin, in partnership with the Royal Australian Navy and our industrial partners, provided an upgrade to the Aegis weapon system on the Hobart-class destroyers. This is an activity that had never been done before outside of the United States. Relying on technology transfer between Australia and the United States, the team was able to do this crucial upgrade, continue to upgrade and maintain the Hobart-class destroyers, and through that transfer, deliver sovereign Australian industrial capability and keep the ships at sea.
Lockheed Martin's F-35 Joint Strike Fighter program is seen as an exemplar of how to deliver sovereign industrial capability.
What it really means, I think, is it creates strategic levers for government. It enables access for the government of today to have access to skills, to infrastructure and to technology right here in our own industrial base. We have a program that has more than 50 Australian companies participating in the production contract for the F-35. And that translates to over 2,000 jobs in Australia today and growing, and also in excess of $1.7 billion in exports that have already been achieved. So that creates real opportunity for a long time to come for Australian industry. And it also, if you think about the sustainment implications for the jets, that's decades more work.
Work for companies like Heat Treatment Australia, a Brisbane-based company that manufactures parts for the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter.
So we provide heat treatment processes, that's thermal processes, for metal components. So it could be something as simple as a piece of machinery for a car or a truck, or it could be as sophisticated as landing gear for an F-35.
Heat Treatment Australia is a family-run business started by Karen Stanton's father. The F-35 program was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
You know, sales were starting to decline in general manufacturing, and Australia wasn't doing particularly well in the broad manufacturing sector. So when we got this approach, we thought that it was a really good opportunity to realign our business, change our strategic direction, and maybe look at some new opportunities in that aerospace and defence field.
A surge in demand meant the business had to expand. Heat Treatment Australia now operates out of 4 premises and with the help of Lockheed Martin, has even established a site in Los Angeles.
The Lockheed team helped us. I mean, on our opening day, we had one of the executives from Fort Worth there to announce our business and to tell our customers that we should be trusted. You know, and those relationships has been what has made that branch successful. So, you know, we're sort of into about 3 or 4 years later, you know, and they're at capacity and they're doing really well, and we're employing more US citizens, and we couldn't really have expected it to do any better. Even in COVID times, it's still actually, you know, doing so well, and we're really proud. Sovereign industry capability will allow us to actually grow our industries, grow our capabilities, and employ more people.
One thing that we've been very successful with is helping Australian companies identify what it is that makes them what it is that makes them special, what it is that makes them unique. It's a global playing field that they're operating in, and they need to compete with companies not just here in Australia, but those throughout the world.
We've now got 15,000 Australian companies in our defence industry supply chain, which is over 70,000 jobs, and that is growing fast. It's significant for 2 reasons. First of all, that we need this capability. Given the deterioration in our strategic circumstances, particularly now with impacts of COVID-19 on our region, these capabilities are very important for our nation's defence. But increasingly we're now seeing through the economic downturn we're experiencing with COVID-19 that this investment in our own nation and not sending this money overseas to other nations is very important.
Maybe it's just because I'm a nerd, Ticky, but one of the things that actually blows me away about the F-35 is regardless of what flag is on the tail of those aeroplanes, there's Australian industry capability built into every single one of them. So every aeroplane flying today has world-class Australian technology built in. That translates to over 5,000 Australian jobs that are supported directly by Lockheed Martin's programs and projects in Australia. And that's outside of our workforce. That's an additional 5,000 jobs directly related to our work in Australia. We have 1,000 women and men who turn up to work every day in every mainland state and territory around the nation. We roll up our sleeves collectively, and we get to work with our Australian defence partners delivering our Australian technology and advanced capabilities.
In the past week, Australia's defence and foreign ministers were in Washington for the Alliance AUSMIN talks, and securing our supply chains has taken on a new urgency. Across manufacturing today, one extraordinary material turns out to be essential: rare earths, or critical minerals. The trouble is, China dominates the production of rare earths.
We've allowed the processing part of those supply chains. All of those critical minerals are found in Australia, the United States, and Canada collectively. But all of the processing, the vast preponderance of the processing of those minerals occurs in China.
These are minerals that are, for example, crucial in a Joint Strike Fighter.
And Joint Strike Fighter and iPhones. And the computers that our intelligence and defense forces and our children use every day. And so absolutely, and we need to have strategically reliable supply chains. So we're focused on an effort to identify the minerals that are most critical to the defense and industrial bases of the United States and Australia and like-minded partners, and making sure that all of those minerals, each and every one of those minerals, is processed in a strategically reliable location, whether it be Australia, United States, Canada, or another partner.
Step forward, Australia's rare earths leader.
And how much of the market does China have of rare earths?
China has, by volume, between about 80 and 85% of the market.
Of the world market?
Of the world market, and Lynas has the rest. So Lynas is the only non-Chinese company that has successfully constructed, ramped up, operated and taken a rare earths company to profitability in the last 2 to 3 decades.
Amanda Lacaze runs Lynas, Australian and, yes, currently the only major player in market share outside China. Lynas has the Mount Weld mine in Western Australia, a processor in Malaysia, and is building a new plant in Kalgoorlie. What makes rare earths so precious is that they are reactive, so they do things other metals don't.
They are in all the things that we like to use in the 21st century. So there is not a single car on the road without rare earths in it.
A decade ago, China cut rare earth exports to Japan during a spat over islands in the South China Sea.
Now, everybody in the West said, oh gosh, that'll be a big problem. Japan responded by funding Lynas, and today Japan's market for rare earths and rare earths processing has grown by about 80% on where it was in 2013, and that's off the back of secure supply from Lynas.
To achieve its supremacy, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter uses 435 pounds, or almost 200 kilos of rare earths. What is more, of that, the fighter needs 30 kilos of heavy rare earths, and that's a problem.
So, am I right in saying, I just want to be clear here, that a Joint Strike Fighter, which in order to fly needs heavy rare earths, the only place that a Joint Strike Fighter can get heavy rare earths from is China?
Separated heavy rare earths. The only place they can get it from is a Chinese supplier.
Just 2 weeks ago, China turned the screw. Angered at America's recommitment to arming Taiwan, it will impose sanctions on Lockheed Martin. China's Global Daily reported that would likely include cutting off rare earth supply. This week, Lynas and its American partner Blue Line won a Phase 1 contract from the US Department of Defense to begin development on a heavy rare earths plant in Texas and close the gap in the supply chain.
Now it's time for us to invest in heavy rare earth separation capability to ensure that non-Chinese customers have security of supply as well.
From the Australian side, it is COVID that actually worries Amanda Lacaze.
So I would rarely spend a week without getting on a plane. Now, in the post-COVID world, that sort of mobility and cross-border mobility is going to take a long time to come back. And because of the US experience with COVID, it is going to take even longer. And that may be more relevant as we think about the siting of our plant than anything. Ultimately, wherever we produce our heavy rare earths, I am confident that they will find their way into the US supply chain.
While China has leveraged its capability in rare earths well, in the end, Amanda Lacaze says markets are controlled by demand, not supply. And she has a message for Western manufacturers needing rare earths.
This issue with supply chains is prevalent across a number of sectors, not just rare earths, and that's why I think governments have been alert to it. But I am less impressed with the purchasing officers in some of the major manufacturers outside of China.
So you're saying, what should they be doing now?
Well, I think that the purchasing officers should be listening to their strategic procurement managers who have said for many years, if we have to pay a 10% premium, it is worth it to ensure we have a resilient supply chain.
Coming up in Part 4, we look to the future and ask what impact the US election will have on the recovery.
The Alliance is brought to you by Austal, Australia's global shipbuilder.
The Alliance, proudly brought to you by Visi, packaging for the food and beverage industries to keep our supermarkets open.
"2020 is the most dramatic year in a generation, and it's far from over, with a presidential election looming in November. Australia is right to ask what impact America's domestic focus will have here in our region. Does it really matter who wins? Gina Reinhardt sees the Trump record on reform and security strengthening the alliance.
Under President Trump's leadership, the relationship between Australia and the US, be that business, defence or other, has never been better. He is an exceptionally strong leader who doesn't let his decisions get swayed or made by media, as too many governments do. He shows the world what needs to be done to create a thriving economy. If President Trump is given another 4 years in November, I think our relationship with the US will go from strength to strength.
Whoever takes the White House will have to conquer COVID and the unrest it has brought to American streets, a much bigger challenge than we have in Australia.
On top of that, the issue that's been around the United States for 150 years is inequality, especially racial inequality. Human value systems being what they are, the United States has not fulfilled the promise of giving everyone equal access to health care and education. So major policy deficits are occurring. We've talked about energy, but what we have not seen is programs around education and health care. I think the United States' ability to do that will actually be prescient in the voters' minds, and this will have to happen no matter who gets elected.
The thing that I think we do great in Australia that, you know, it's a hot political topic in America at the moment, is the social safety net. You know, and I think the art that Australia's pulled off better than anyone in the world, and this may have a lot to do with our superannuation system, has been to have great medical, etc., without bankrupting the country.
In all our travels, pretty unanimously, we have found that Australian and American leaders see the bond of the alliance as far more important than who is president or prime minister.
It is bigger than the partisan nature of American politics, but you can't take it for granted. And there are a lot of countries that have fallen by the wayside because they've failed to be able to manage the volatility of American politics.
At the Osmin meeting, our joint leaders are shaping the alliance mission for security in the Asia-Pacific region far beyond the next election.
We need to take stock of where those, where those interactions are happening. And we need to do that not just with a setup that says it's the US versus China. It's all like-minded against this authoritarian idea of, might makes right and all deals should benefit one versus the others.
I think we have to be the tugboat moving that aircraft carrier in the right direction, because we're a trusted tugboat, to use that analogy. That is an important role for our country. And I think the other thing we've got to do is find a way to keep China attached. Now, the detachment of China may be irreversible because they want to create their own thing, and they are. But we can play a role in keeping those two countries attached. Geopolitically, the US regression is not good for the world. Okay? Europe's not going to step up, and China won't step up. So a G20 country like Australia that always punches above its weight, this is our calling card, by the way. We punch above our weight, and we're damn good at it. So let's figure a way to punch above our weight to make a difference in the evolution of this new relationship. And I think Australia can help the US on that.
Just a fortnight ago, Anthony Pratt committed another $1 billion to Australian manufacturing and sustainability, buying the largest glass bottler in Australia and New Zealand from America's Ohio Glass. It will secure 7,200 well-paid manufacturing jobs, and there are plans to increase the recycled content of glass from 1/3 to 2/3.
Recovery is going to be painful. This is the single largest leap, certainly in the US and for other parts of the world, that we've experienced in unemployment we've experienced since the Great Depression. People are mistaking the stock market with meaning the world is good again. No, that just means stocks are trading well right now. That doesn't mean economic recovery has occurred. People are thinking that because we're returning to our offices that the economy has recovered. That isn't so. It's going to be a slow road. But it's also, never let a crisis go to waste. It's an opportunity to really reflect on how to make institutions, how to make governments, countries much more efficient in what they do. Stop focusing on the stuff that actually didn't matter, which has been exposed during this crisis, and really focus on where you have natural advantages. And that's where I come back to Australia, highly intelligent population, highly educated, great quality of life, because of its politics, has been able to negotiate a position where it can trade with all the countries you want to trade with around the world. How do you accelerate that coming out of this crisis? What is it going to learn from that? That's really the question. But it's Ticky, this is not going to be a rapid turnaround. This is going to take a couple of years. But it'll be fun. We'll all get there.
In our last episode, the ties that bind, our sport, our entertainment, and our living legends. The shared culture that has forged what we've come to know as the Alliance.
At Verizon, we keep companies ready for what's next. When it comes to digital transformation, we're here and we're ready. The Alliance is brought to you by Verizon.